Welcome to the second lecture in the series on media and environment. And this lecture is going to be on media and the environmental agenda. Let us first start looking at the role of media. Media are vehicles of free expression, and they are seen as progressive agents of social change, giving voice to the people and reformers. By fulfilling the watchdog role, the media are expected to work as a major force in bringing the attention of the people and the policymakers to the issue of public interest. They are seen as crusading forces leading society to a better future. Media can be instruments of social control as much as they can be vehicles of free expression. By writing stories of a certain kind and ignoring the other kind, media try to define what accepted behavior is and what is not. They have the ability to change the environmental behavior of the people. And media can be used to legitimize the status quo in society, but they can also be used to challenge the status quo. Although media tend to support the dominant values and the system norms, they have been found to be more liberal than the elite groups or the general public in society. That means that journalists have the ability to produce stories that challenge the status quo. And by providing facts and opinions, media may help speed up the process of resolving an issue. For any problem to become part of the public discourse, media coverage is crucial. The mass media play a major role as a forum for public debate where various social groups, institutions, and ideologies struggle over the definition and construction of social reality. For any problem to become part of the public discourse, media coverage is crucial. Otherwise, the problem will be ignored. Now, let us look at how environmental issues came into the media. Media played a key role in turning the environmental problems into issues. Although people had been aware of environmental degradation to a limited extent, media played a crucial role in broadening awareness and making it an issue for public debate. Problems experienced by people were redefined as part of a more general problem of the environment. Media coverage became vital in defining and framing a problem as an environmental problem. The media were initially slow in grasping the essence of environmentalism, leaving it to issue entrepreneurs who tried to get public attention to the issues outside media. Entrepreneurs are those who raise issues in the public fora. These include activists and environmental groups and also affected people. In the early years of the environmental debate, the media were unsure about the increasing number of claims by scientists that normal human activities were posing a threat to the environment. Some journalists would spend a lot of time on the ground and speak to researchers to understand a problem, but they would not succeed in convincing their editors to carry their stories. Very few editors agreed to carry the reports painstakingly prepared by some of their own reporters. Now let us look at the complexity of environmental issues, because environmental issues are different from other issues that the journalists cover. Covering environmental issues, which are at times extraordinarily complex, requires a sophisticated understanding of science, ethics, law, economics, politics, history, and international relations. Environmental concerns usually involve a long and tenuous string of interrelated concerns. To a large extent, media coverage of environmental issues is constrained and shaped by the political economy of media, professional values, and a journalist's sense of what constitutes news. Since what happens makes news, it seems that news is always or mainly concerned with the unusual and the unexpected. There are deadlines to be met. Instead of digging for information, reporters opt for a diet of routine news derived from a mix of scheduled events and pre-formulated accounts of events to meet the deadlines and story quotas. The focus in news coverage is on outcomes of events rather than on the processes, social and political context that produce those events are not fully explained. News that conforms to the existing formats is favored over longer and more nuanced stories that deal with underlying causes and conditions that relate to the environment. Now let us look at how the media perform the role of setting the environmental agenda. Let us begin with the famous statement of Bernard Cohen. He said, "The press may not be successful much of the time in telling people what to think, but it is stunningly successful in telling its readers what to think about." So this statement clearly tells us that media may not be effective in making people what to think, but they will certainly make us talk about something, think about something, or discuss about something. The power of the press is usually associated with its ability to set the agenda. The media highlight or de-emphasize certain issues. This affects the public perception of the salience of these issues. By selecting and displaying certain issues, media shape political reality. The audience not only get to know about a particular issue, but also learn about how much importance to attach to the issue. Selection of environmental issues and giving them prominent space and time consistently over a period of time suggests that the media are setting the environmental agenda. Studies have shown that public concern can partially be independent of actual environmental deterioration and can be shaped by other considerations such as media coverage. An issue may be recognized as an environmental issue only because the issue has been covered by media, not otherwise. Now let us look at the issue attention cycle. For a problem to be perceived as important, it is essential that the media consistently report about it over a long period with news stories, articles, investigative reports, features, and editorials. Otherwise, public attention may not remain focused on an issue for a long time. How long the public attention remains on an environmental issue may be determined by the media coverage of that issue. The media may pay attention to an issue for some time and then move on to other issues, ignoring their agenda setting role. According to Anthony Downs, public attention rarely remains sharply focused upon any one issue for very long, as the attention span of the media audiences has decreased over the years. Instead, a systematic issue attention cycle seems to strongly influence public attitudes and behavior concerning most key environmental problems. The issue attention cycle has 5 stages, according to Anthony Downs. The first is the pre-problem stage, where some highly undesirable social conditions exist, but they have not yet captured much public attention, even though some experts or interest groups may already be alarmed by them. The second stage is the alarm discovery and euphoric enthusiasm. As a result of some dramatic events or for other reasons, the public suddenly becomes both aware of and alarmed about the evils of a particular problem. Now, the third stage is realizing the cost of significant progress. A realization spreads that the cost of solving the problem is very high indeed. And then comes the fourth stage in the issue attention cycle. The fourth stage is the gradual decline of intense public interest. The public desire to keep attention focused on the issue wanes as people begin to realize the complexity of the problem and no possibility of finding a simple solution. Around this time, some other issues enter the second stage and grab public attention through their novelty. So the earlier issues are forgotten and new issues are taken up. The final stage is the post-problem stage, where an issue that has been replaced at the center of the public concern moves into a prolonged limbo, That means the issue is entirely forgotten for a very long time until it may re-emerge again after some time, after probably some months or some years. Downs pointed out that the media may help accelerate or decrease the cycle of a movement. In the same way as other social problems, the environmental problems lose their attraction for the media and the public, although the problem or the problems themselves remain. People become discouraged or bored with increasing environmental risks and uninterrupted reporting about them. Media competing with each other for the public have to shift their focus to some new and more attractive problems because they have to retain their readers or viewers. The environment as an issue or a particular environmental problem does not receive constant attention of the media, but goes through the cycle of rise and fall. The issue attention cycle is an indication of media not setting the environmental agenda. The attention span of the audiences has been decreasing over the years, and the complex environmental issues unfold over the extended period. It is really hard for reporters to find new specs for their stories. The protests against the building of the Tehri Dam in an eco-sensitive area hogged the headlines for a long time. The newspapers became the voice of the people who were going to be affected by the dam. The Tehri Dam, then in Uttar Pradesh. When the construction of the dam continued despite the campaign, the newspapers lost their steam. They stopped covering it on regular basis. Very few stories appeared in media about the Tehri Dam. By the time the whole Tehri town got submerged in the dam waters, the media had reconciled to the fact that the dam was going to be completed, and they moved on to the other issues. So the issue attention cycle tells us that media report on some issues for some time, and then they start ignoring them when the problem reaches some stage, when they begin to think that nothing can be done about it anymore. Let us look at the possibility of overcoming the issue of attention cycle. So there are several ways, through which the issue attention cycle can be overcome. Environmental groups, activists, and the affected persons organize dramatic events and novel protests to attract public attention. To continue to get media attention, the International Campaign for Justice for Bhopal has often organized dramatic events, and it has got the public and the media attention. Since hunger strikes were no longer attracting the media attention, International Campaign for Justice for Bhopal, ICJB, used direct action methods like Padayatra, which means journey on foot, Dharna, that is sit in protest, Dayin. Dayin means covering themselves with a white cloth as if they are dead bodies, and remaining there for a longer time in front of the cameras, in front of the public. That is what Dayin is. And then burning of the effigy of Warren Anderson, who was the CEO of the Union Carbide company at that point of time. And then Mir Jafar Award for treachery and Hall of Shame Award to the bureaucrats, politicians, lawyers, and corporate heads to engage the media, directly, were actually, used by these activists. The purpose of the novel ways of protest was to create spectacle through the images, stories, and actions that capture media attention, because the Bhopal issue was being ignored by the national media, the protesters resorted to all these ways of keeping the issue in front of the media. For that purpose, they used lot of these dramatic and novel forms of protests. So this is one way of breaking the issue attention cycle and keeping the issue alive for a longer time. Now let us look at how media began to recognize environmental issues in the first place. Widespread recognition of the environment as an issue by the media was noticed in the early 1970s in Europe and in USA. When the Earth Day was celebrated on April 22nd, 1970, the mass media afforded the environmental issue instant and widespread recognition. The interpretation of Earth Day as day one of the new environmentalism was widely embraced by the media. As the environment moved from being a fringe issue to an issue of paramount concern to the public, the media began paying greater attention to it. In the same year, the New York Times created an environment beat, a practice that would be followed by major newspapers across the United States. So in the 1970s, many American newspapers and also European newspapers began appointing environmental reporters who reported only on environmental issues. Television networks began broadcasting special programs on pollution, and newspapers hired environmental reporters to report on specific issues. And advertising agencies began emphasizing ecological features of the products that they were selling. And book companies published environmental paperbacks, and magazines devoted entire issues to the protection of nature. So by the time the United Nations Conference on Environment was held in 1972, there was a considerable rise in the press coverage of the environmental issues. An information explosion occurred in the mass media, leading to a rise in public concern for the environment. In the United States and Europe, many newspapers recognized the environment as an issue by starting environmental beats, because there was irrefutable damage to the environment that had been caused, and this was visible. And there were frequent protests from citizens groups, and these citizens group had put environmental concerns on the public agenda. What was more important was that the environment was treated as a political story. Pollution and protection were being hotly debated in legislatures, and opposition parties found that they could score points in the media by attacking governments for failing to protect the public from environmental degradation. So there were a lot of discussions going on in the parliaments and also outside, and the opposition parties continued to raise those issues, and media were reporting about the issues raised by the opposition political leaders. More and more media began to take the environment seriously. Media interest in the environment seemed to grow till the late 1970s, after which a declining trend was visible. By the early 1980s, there was already a decline in environmental reporting in the United States and Europe. By the mid-1970s, environmental reporting had increased, but by the late 1980s, it had, by the early 1980s, it had declined. In most newspapers, environmental beats disappeared and became part of general news or science reporting, and reporters who continued to write on environmental issues were often starved of space and time in newspapers. So what was happening in the early 1970s had changed by the early 1980s. But then there was a positive change towards the late 1980s. media reporting of environmental problems increased at the end of the 1980s, reaching a peak in 1989-90 in many countries around the world, and declining steadily after that. Let us look at environmental issues in Indian media. What attention Indian media paid to the environmental issues. The Indian media for a long time did not consider the environment as a serious issue. They were reflecting the views of the political leaders and policymakers whose concern was development rather than the environment. When the United Nations Conference on Human Environment was held at Stockholm in 1972, very few Indian media correspondents attended the conference. There are very few Indian journalists found at the Stockholm conference. The environmental concern was dismissed as a Western fad and irrelevant to the third world countries. In fact, the attitude of the press appeared to be in line with the Prime Minister Indira Gandhi's defense of development over the environment at the conference. She argued that if development meant more smoke, India would love to have more of it. So this attitude of the Prime Minister was reflected in the attention that the Indian media paid to the environmental issues. But then a gradual change began to happen. There was a change in the attitude of the press. By the late 1970s, the press began taking some interest in the environment after the Chipko movement began in the Himalayas for the protection of forests. The Chipko movement was the first popular struggle against the destruction of the environment in independent India that received international recognition. When environmental news began appearing in the media in the 1970s, it was seen as part of a broad area of development journalism. Even to this day, many newspapers think that environmental reporting is something that is part of development reporting. Now let us look at some of the events that impacted Indian media. The Bhopal disaster of December 1984 proved to be the turning point in the environmental journalism in India. The magnitude of the disaster shook many newspapers out of their indifference to environmental problems. Those newspapers which had ignored the environment as an issue began to pay attention, and thousands of correspondents descended on Bhopal to cover the worst ever industrial disaster in history. More than 8,000 people died soon, and many more people died later after the Bhopal gas tragedy. So this had sent shockwaves throughout India and throughout the world, and this actually shook the media persons out of their indifference. And accessing reliable information was the biggest challenge for the journalists. The disaster continued to make news for years as the victims carried on a long struggle for justice. In fact, the struggle is still going on. The victims of the Bhopal gas tragedy have not yet received the compensation they deserved. So it is still an ongoing issue, and people who are affected by this gas leak are still suffering from various diseases, including physical and mental. The dramatic increase in the number of environment-related events following the disaster indicated growing awareness among the people about the environment. More environment-related events meant more environmental news. With the increase in awareness, several campaigns were launched against environmentally destructive projects. So in the 1980s, you will notice that a lot of environmental movements began in India in different parts, in different states. The anti-nuclear campaigns intensified in the wake of the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. This anti-nuclear campaign involved writers, artists, film stars, and religious leaders. And these leaders were arguing against building of nuclear power plants. But these protests gave dramatic news for the newspapers. These protesters resorted to various forms of protest. They protested at the sites, they protested in cities, they protested in the capital. For example, in Karnataka, protests went on for several days in Bangalore. So environmental pressure groups that realized the importance of publicity began interacting with the pressmen by providing them information and by taking them on a tour of the controversial project sites. In fact, the protesters in Bangalore took journalists to Kaiga, where a power plant was proposed in the early 1980s. There was a healthy cooperation between the press and the activists. The environmental movements became more active in the 1980s. Therefore, there was more coverage of the environmental news. There was the Silent Valley movement in the early 1980s, the Silent Valley project, which was shelved in 1983. There was Opiko movement, which tried to protect forest in Uttara Kannada district of Karnataka. And of course, there was Kaiga. There were several other protests during the 1980s. And the other important movement of the 1980s was the Save the Western Ghats movement, where people walked thousands of kilometers educating people about the dangers of building industries in the Western Ghats region. In the 1990s, things began to change. We looked at how the United Nations Conference on Human Environment in Stockholm in 1972 was ignored by Indian journalists. In 20 years, a lot had changed in Indian media and also in the perception of the government or the leaders who are running the government. The Rio Summit the Rio Earth Summit happened in 1992. And we'll notice that hundreds of journalists went to the Rio Summit and took active part in it. In fact, a lot of newspapers began bringing out special supplements, special pages, and they were giving day-to-day reports of the discussions and consultations that were going on at Stockholm. In fact, Prajavani's correspondent Nagesh Hegde also went to Rio to take part in the summit, and he filed reports from there. If you look at the way media started covering the environmental issues, here is a graph that shows how media coverage of environmental issues increased from 1980 to 1998. So this is an 18-year period. It is not a recent one, but it's an old one. But it tells us how it actually increased. So if you look at this graph, you will notice that it was less than 1% in the beginning, and then it slightly went on increasing. In 1986, the environmental news increased in Indian media, and this graph is actually showing environmental content in Indian English daily newspapers, major English daily newspapers. So 1986 was the year in which the environmental coverage went up to nearly 2%. Otherwise, in the previous years, the coverage was very less. Even in the later years, as the graph shows, environmental coverage increased overall, but did not reach the level of coverage that was found in 1986. So 1986 was a crucial year, as we have already noticed. 86 was an important year because Chernobyl accident had taken place, and then before that there was Bhopal gas tragedy, and there was also passing of an important legislation, the Environmental Protection Act of 1986. There was a lot of discussion going on that. So, a lot of key events took place in 1986, and that shows how the coverage increased in 1986. Let us look at the media debate on environmental issues. In fact, there was an explosion of investigative journalism in the 1980s. In fact, the Indian Express newspaper was in the vanguard of this investigative journalism. Investigations were done on government schemes, on violation of human rights in jails. So the 1980s saw an explosion of investigative journalism in India. And that was the time when newspapers attempted to dig out information about the controversial projects which were likely to cause environmental hazards. And the 1980s also saw a significant rise in the number of public interest litigations. A lot of environmentalists moved the courts, under PIL and questioned the rationale of projects, and they brought up lot of environmental and human rights issues. They argued that those projects would cause a lot of harm to the livelihoods of people. In fact, the court too, in several cases, came to the rescue of those who were about to lose their lands and about to lose their rights. And there was also something like judicial activism. In some of the cases, the court took suo motu action. He acted on his own to address the issues related to the environment. And the anti-dam movements of the mid-1990s got a lot of attention of the media. The struggle against the Sardar Sarovar Dam and the Tehri Dam were widely reported, and a public debate on the environmental consequences of big dams began. In fact, the Narmada movement was the most visible movement of the 1990s, and big dam became an issue of discussion. Journalists, environmentalists, activists, policymakers, planners, all of them began expressing their views through the columns of newspapers. And in the early 21st century, there were a lot of movements against special economic zones, because special economic zones took away a lot of land that belonged to the people, and people had been protesting against them, seeking justice and also fair compensation. So several special economic zones were created in several parts of the country in order to achieve quick economic growth. But then, whether they achieved quick economic growth or not, that is questionable. But then they did create a lot of environmental problems, and there was a lot of resistance to special economic zones, and the media duly covered these protests. In fact, the English press appeared to be very slow in picking up environmental stories. Very few English newspapers took initiative in reporting environmental stories. The reports about people's action for environmental protection appeared first in local Indian language newspapers, and then in the major Indian language newspapers, and later in the English dailies. This tells us that the local newspapers have a greater interest in environmental issues than in the state language newspapers or bigger state circulated language newspapers. But then these English newspapers took some time to recognize environmental issues. And the newspapers have contributed to the beginning of an informed public debate on environmental issues. So what we notice is that the media over the years have created a lot of awareness about environmental issues. They have given a lot of coverage to the environmental struggles of the people and the issues raised by the environmental groups. So in a way, or to a limited extent, the media have in fact set the environmental agenda, if not fully, to some extent. With this, we end this second lecture. Thank you.